In the winter of 1902, the ground along Hollow Creek did not soften. It clung to its frost like a clenched jaw. Snow lay in narrow ribs between the laurel and the pine. The sky kept low. Men said you could smell iron in the air, as if the mountain bled somewhere out of sight. On the second night of December, a lamp burned in a window no one had dared to pass since the collapse of '98. It was a small flame, pale as a tooth. Yet it held the attention of the valley until the wick died with a sigh just before dawn. Before the wick went out, 3 people saw shapes cross the ridge. 2 lights. One steady, one that stammered as if carried by a trembling hand. By the 4th night, 3 homesteads stood open to the weather doors, straining on leather hinges, cups left half full, bacon blackening on hooks. Searchers found no prints near the thresholds, none near the yards. Only a narrow trail pressed deep into crusted snow, not by boots nor by bare feet. A slender, pointed mark, precise as a pen stroke. Beside it a broader impression, dragged and unsteady, as if a widow in mourning walked hand in hand with something that had been long under rock. The bell at Keller's store did not ring those nights. The men inside did not speak above a murmur. And when they did, they used the old mountain habit of turning names into weather, she, him, that woman down by the bend, so the air might not learn whom to punish. Folks knew the widow, Eliza Marin. They used the gentlest words for her. Gentle words are a way of admitting fear. The valley was a narrow bowl tucked between 2 ridges, Gospel Ridge to the east, Merritt's Shoulder to the west. Morning came late because sunlight had to crawl down the spine of the pines and slide between the trunks before it touched the creek. Smoke from the mine houses did not rise. It drifted sideways like a second river, smudging the air with coal and creosote. The creek's water was clear in the shallows and black in the deep shelves. So clear a man could watch the trout with their ragged fins and still not guess the depth until the bottom fell away with a cold surprise. Work began with the bell at the No. 3 tipple. The bell was iron. It spoke without joy. Men shouldered lunch pails dented by years. The mules knew the way and tugged their collars as if eager to meet darkness where darkness lived. Women in shawls shook stove ash into buckets and envied nothing beyond the ridge, because beyond the ridge was distance. And distance was a risk that did not pay. Keller's store sat like a monk in the middle of it all. A slow, square building with a warped porch, tobacco nailed above the door, glass jars of peppermint that never seemed to empty because men bought salt, not candy. The store smelled of wool, kerosene, damp timber, and a sweet rot no one named but everyone knew. In winter, the front window filmed with frost so thick that the children drew circles in it with their breath and looked through the clearings like spy holes into another world the town carried its people the way a river carries twigs. You could tell a man by the soot stitched at the seams of his coat, by the cough that woke him before rooster or bell. And yet the town trusted someone. They trusted Eliza. She lived at the last cabin before the trees lifted into the steep. A small house with a narrow porch and a roof that carried snow without complaint. Her lantern hung from a bent nail. She kept it trimmed with a patient hand. She wore black even when the laurel bloomed like paper flames. Her shawl had been darned so often the darning had become the shawl. When folks said widow, they meant a woman shaped by silence. But Eliza's silence wasn't empty. It had weight. It had a sort of direction, like a hand on the elbow. Asterisk, they said her husband, Jonas Marin, died in the collapse. That was 4 winters back. 42 men gone in a single shudder. The mountain closed its jaw on their names. The rescue timber splintered like wishbones. Rain filled the shaft mouth and froze to a black lid by morning. The register book at Bales & Company Mines never found room for 42 burials because there were no bodies to bury. The foreman wrote unrecovered in a tired hand and went home to wash silt from the creases of his neck. Eliza sat on the porch that winter with a lantern. Every night until snowstorms stopped being weather and became a habit of the land. She would not go to the camp meeting when the pastor read out the names on a chill Sunday. She listened from the edge of the grove and left before the hymns, because the hymns made promises and she distrusted promises made in sunlight. A child once asked her why she left the lantern burning till dawn. Eliza smiled with only half her mouth. "Some men need a light to find their way back," she said. The child did not ask what back meant. Among the men, Ephraim Bales, foreman, a stern figure with a scar that traveled from the corner of his eye into his hair. He kept Ada Pike, midwife and herbal woman, kept an apron that could not be washed clean of blood or milk. She frowned at the creek when it was high and muttered that water keeps memory the way honey keeps light. Silas Crow, a widower with a permanent tremor, drank lamp oil once by mistake and lived. He spent a portion of each evening naming his dead, then forgetting whom he had named. Tobias Finch, 14, thin as a bowstring, watched the mule train with a fascination that made men nervous, because they saw in him the hunger to go beneath. And Keller, who ran the store, heard everything and knew how to do nothing with it except keep a tally of the soft weight of secrets. The town was a list of chores disguised as lives. The list did not end. It did not forgive. If you were steady, it made no complaint. If you stumbled, it marked the stumble in its book. Eliza's name was in that book, somewhere between salt and lantern oil, between black cloth and bread flour. She bought little. She paid in coins that looked older than her hands. When she entered Keller's, the bell sounded as if struck underwater. Men looked to their boots. Women counted their pins. Eliza smelled, some said, like a new grave, not the rot, but the wet clay. Others said no. It was iron, a scent that caught at the teeth. No one said this to her face. You do not say such things to a widow who keeps watch the way a lighthouse keeps watch, not for ships, but for something that might not be a ship at all. Evidence, a extract from the Hollis Journal, found in Reverend Hollis's desk. Hill Chapel, December 1902, ink browned. Margin scored with fingernail marks. Nov. 29I. Will set down this matter so that my mind may not be solely a place of shadows. Eliza Marin has left her porch lantern burning every night this month, though the wind is fierce and the snow a punishment. I passed by 2 nights since and saw, as God is witness, a second light inside her house, low to the floor, as if a man held a miner's lamp and moved in a small circle. The way they do when warming hands. I rebuked myself and prayed. But last night I went again, and the second light was not inside. It was on the ridge behind her cabin, moving along the tree line. 2 lights, twinned, with a distance between them that is not the span of human arms. I am not yet afraid, only bereft. I desire to speak with her, and yet I do not. If Jonas has returned, let him do so by the door of the church where men may see him by day. The Reverend was a man who preferred grief to fear. Grief had rules. Fear did not. His words arranged themselves carefully. The margin spoke another language, pressure. The valley kept its hours through December's early dark. Daylight made a thin attempt at noon, then retreated. Dogs howled at nothing. They say dogs see backwards in time when the air is this cold. Like looking up a well and reading the names carved in the stones. On the 5th of December, Tobias Finch was sent to the No. 3 to carry a message and returned shivering with news that was not news, yet just a shape the size of a man in conversation with someone on a porch. Tobias swore he saw Eliza raise her hand as if smoothing a collar that wasn't there. He heard her speak, though the wind was loud. Not yet. Not yet what? Keller asked when the boy told it. But Tobias had bitten his tongue in his hurry and bled so much into his mouth that names came out as whistles. On the 8th, Caleb Rourke, a logger with shoulders like barn beams, did not appear for dawn. The men who worked his claim found his yard neat as a sermon. His axe was caught in the block half split, a curl of frozen sap clinging to the blade. No prints, no scuffle. Just the trail. Not a boot trail. A thin, pointed thing, like the print of a lady's heel if the lady never bent the leather with a step. Beside it the wide, dragging half-moons of something that remembered how to walk but had forgotten why. They followed the trail downhill until Ada Pike said no and pulled her shawl tight. "Leave it," she said. "Leave it to its own." "Whose?" Someone asked. "It knows," Ada said, and would not say the name. But the trail's logic was simple. It moved toward the creek and then to the last cabin before the trees. Toward Eliza. That night, a message appeared under the church door. Not nailed. Shoved as if the hand did not trust wood to hold it. Evidence B scrap of ledger paper, source paper, Bales & Co. Hay ledger. Margin torn away. Ink uneven. The word remember written twice. The first crossed out with a careful line. She walks with him. He is not buried. The mountain does not forget. Watch the lanterns, no signature. The Reverend flattened it with his palm and did not show it to the wives. He told Keller. Keller told no one. But secrets do not keep in winter. They leak through the chinks like cold. The mine itself was a sermon, conducted by. That same night, a hymn wandered through the pines above Eliza's place. An old tune. Not quite church. Miners' music. Men stared at their ceilings and counted beams. Wives stitched faster, the needle a bright bite in lamplight. The hymn moved along the ridge the way a bruise moves under skin. Slow, inward. Near midnight, the bell at Hill Chapel rang once. Then, after a pause twice, Reverend Hollis rose from his pallet and went to the door with the air of a man answering a gentle knock that might be God or might be wind. The rope swayed. No hand on it. He touched the rope. It was cold as iron laid on a tongue. He looked toward the ridge. Saw two lights where there should be none. He whispered a verse that did not match the sight and failed to master his own breath. He should have woken Keller. He should have woken Bales. Instead, he wrote. Because writing is how a man pretends at order. Daylight dwindled and grew all the more suspicious. Men worked closer to the mouth of the shaft, though work paid deeper. They tightened harness on mules and spoke their names aloud with a steady voice, because names hold animals to the world when the world shifts beneath them. The creek rhymed with ice. The trees made a porcelain sound when the wind touched them. House cats slept with their faces hidden, and no woman would carry ash to the pile after sundown. Ada Pike hung dried roots in her rafters and tied a red thread around her wrist, so she would not walk in her sleep. The thread broke. She tied it again. It broke a second time at the same hour, between 1 and 2. At that hour, Ada heard picks. Down then up, she told Hollis when she came to him with her shawl thrown over her head. Do you hear? The sound goes down, as if the ground eats it, and then up, as if the sound burps. Hollis did not laugh. He knew a burp is a return in a low manner. He knew the mountain would be a low manner too. On the 15th, the Rourke cabin began to smell not of rot but of wet earth. Keller opened the door and found nothing moved. The soup on the stove had frozen into a white glaze. A Bible lay open to Lamentations, not because someone had reached for comfort, but because the Bible had fallen and the pages had stopped there. The floor showed no step. Keller bent and touched the threshold with 2 fingers and then put those fingers to his tongue, as mountain men do when they cannot trust their eyes. Clay, not house dust. Clay, cold and ordained to be underfoot, yet here. Inside. He closed the door gently and set his palm to it the way a man sets his palm to a horse, about to bolt. Don't, he said softly, not to anyone outside, but to the door. As if a door could be persuaded not to open of its own accord, he walked quickly to the widow's place. He meant to pass it by. He did not. Eliza stood on the porch with no coat. Snow melted where she stood, a dark oval like a grave with no edge. Her face did not hold grief the way faces hold grief. It held practice. "Keller," she said, double quotes Mrs. Marin. He answered, "You keep the accounts," she said. "I do." "The mountain keeps a better one," she said. "But it does not write numbers. It writes weights." He did not understand her words then. He would later, when he hefted something he believed was lighter and found it heavier than a man. She lifted her eyes to the ridge. The second lantern stammered and then steadied. She looked relieved the way a woman might be relieved to hear a cough in the next room. "That is, relieved and afraid," Keller said, "because the storekeeper part of him refused to die. Need anything?" Eliza smiled with the wrong half of her mouth this time. "Yes," she said. "Salt. For keeping," she said, and went inside before he could count the measure. The knights learned to arrive earlier. They made a point of it. The wind fell silent just before moonrise, the way a crowd falls silent before a judge speaks. In those ribbons of silence the valley could hear the small things: mice creep, shutters tick, the slow roll of a nut from a rafter beam, and then, from the ridge, the picks dot at first as memory, then as fact. Men who had promised their wives to stay put found their boots at the door by midnight. Men who had sworn to leave certain names asleep woke those names with a whisper, as if calling a dog. Bales sat in the chair with his boots on and a coat over his knees, like a soldier posted at the gate of a city he did not want to defend. He stared at a map of the old workings and rubbed with his thumb at a pencil mark where the tunnel had failed. He told himself that air moves strangely under snow, that echoes dress themselves in the wool of winter and walk among houses. He told himself what a man tells himself when the truth is something. His language has not practiced. Eliza touched the boards with her open hand. Snow fell in a thin veil from the upper plank and made a drift along the bottom where drifts should not form. When she lifted her hand away, coal dust blacked her palm. She wiped it absently on her shawl. Ada winced as if she'd seen blood. They walked back down without speaking. They did not look behind them, because something followed that was not a thing and had no feet and yet kept pace. That evening, Hollis climbed his pulpit and read, simply, "The dead shall hear the voice," and closed the book. No hymn, no amen. He set the book down as if it were a tool he no longer trusted. The congregation stood. They did not leave. They waited for the bell to ring them out. It did not. The bell rope hung still. After a minute, the entire assembly began to breathe in unison, not prayer. Fear has a rhythm. It can be conducted. Children slept early that night and dreamed the dream of being caught between two doors and not remembering which leads in and which leads out. Wives set cups of water by their husbands' beds, not because the men asked, but because a dry mouth is a mouth that cannot call. Eliza did not sleep. She set her lantern on the sill. She hummed the second verse of the old miner's hymn very softly. Two lights moved at the edge of the trees. One paused, then tilted. She tilted her head and answered. The wind paused to listen. In Hollow Creek, that winter, even the weather learned to keep its voice low. The 18th of December dawned with a strange brightness, that the warmth of sunlight, but the clean, flat glow that comes when the sky itself freezes and refuses to move. A brightness without heat, without blessing, a brightness that felt like a question. The mountain was asking the people of Hollow Creek. The first man to see the change was Tobias Finch, who rose before daylight to fetch kindling. He found the woodpile undisturbed, but the ground around it swept clean it by broom. Not by wind, swept the way you sweep a room before a burial. He crouched low and touched the earth. The snow in a tight circle had melted to mud. Steam lifted from it, in a thin thread, wavering like a ghost stretching its back after a long, cold night. The circle led away from the Woodpile in a straight linean, then in another enda. Third. 3 circles. 3 trails, all converging toward the path that ran past Eliza. Marin's cabin. Tobias dropped the kindling and ran. Inside, his mother slapped his shoulder for the fright. But when she looked out the window and saw the circles, she crossed herself with a shaking hand she hadn't used for prayer in years. What do they want? She whispered. Tobias answered without thinking, her. By midday, word had spread. Men filed past the circles with their hats pulled down, wives clutching children toward their skirts like birds shielding their eggs. From a coming storm. Ada Pike came last. She knelt beside one of the melted circles and pressed 2 fingers into the damp earth. When she raised her hand, gray mud clung to her skin, and she shook her head slowly, uneasily. This mud, she said, isn't from topsoil. This is shaft clay. Clay that ain't seen light in years. Maybe the heat vented up from a fissure, someone offered. Ada snorted. Clay don't climb out of the earth tidy as a footprint and walk itself to a widow's house. Silence gathered around her like smoke. Wind rises. Faint tapping, irregular. That evening, Keller kept his store open late, not because anyone needed supplies, but because men needed a place to place their fear. The stove glowed red around the iron edges, but no one sat close to it. They stood instead in a half circle, each man watching the others the way horses watch the tree line when they smell wolves. Foreman Bales stood with his arms crossed so tightly his gloves creaked. This is foolishness, he said. Signs in the snow, children's talk, shadows and fear. Yet his eyes drifted, as if unwillingly, toward the window, toward the direction of the Marin cabin. Not fear, Keller murmured. Pattern. Things visiting the same place leave a pattern. Things, Bales repeated, sour. What things? No one answered, because they all knew that the word things kept its shape even when a man whispered it. It was Reverend Hollis who arrived, breathless just before closing. His coat was dusted with snow. His eyes wild with something he'd tried and failed to pray away. Hollis, Ada said, standing from her chair. What now? He swallowed, took off his hat, twisted it once in his hands. I heard talking, he said. The stove crackled. Where? Bales asked. The ridge. Keller stiffened. Men talking? Hollis shook his head. Only one voice. Eliza's. She was answering someone. The bell above the store door rattled faintly, though no one touched it. Bales stepped closer. Whose voice was she answering? Hollis cleared his. Keller leaned over his shoulder, holding a lamp. A fresh tunnel burrowed downward beneath the crawlspacia narrow shaft, wet at the edges. As though dug by hands that did not bleed and did not rest. It descended in a straight line, deeper than a man could crawl. Hollis's voice was a scraped whisper. Something dug its way up. Ada asked. Up from where? The answer hung in the air like breath crystallizing. Bales swallowed and said, barely audible, the collapse. That night, the valley decided without discussion that no man should walk alone after sunset. But fear obeys no curfew. The ridge glowed faintly again, and the moon pulled shadows long as stories. At the schoolhouse, a window cracked outward glass, pushed by force inside. Inside lay handprints, small as a child's and wide as a man's, pressed into the frost. In the church, the Bible opened on its own. Pages fluttered to a verse Hollis had not chosen, and the earth gave up its dead. Keller found footprints behind his store, not the pointed narrow trails they'd seen in the snow, but broad, heavy ones, the kind a strong man leaves when pulling weight uphill. But no such man lived in Hollow Creek, and the trail led toward the Marin cabin. Near midnight, Eliza herself walked the road, her lantern swung by her side, steady as a heartbeat. From a distance, she appeared alone, But Hollis was close enough to see what no one else dared confirm. A second glow moved beside her, low to the ground, flickering, as though carried by a hand not made for carrying, and between her lantern and that smaller, trembling one, the air bent, as though around a shape too dark to reflect light. Hollis called out, "Eliza!" Stop, she did. Just. Not the way a living woman stops. She froze, lantern still, breath absent. Then she turned her head slowly, like someone listening through a wall, to something beneath the soil. Hollis approached, breath shaking. "Eliza, did you hear me?" "Yes," she said softly, but her lips did not move. "What walks with you?" Her eyes drifted to the next lantern toe, the flickering light dot to the invisible shape that held it. She whispered, "What was promised?" Hollis stepped back. "Promised? By whom?" "By the earth," she said, "and by me." The next morning brought the worst sign yet, the old mine bell, one buried during the collapse, began to ring. Not loud, not bright. A dull, distant clanging, as though the bell still hung somewhere deep underground. Struck by a hand that remembered its duty but not its strength, the sound echoed up through the mountain, through the frozen soil, through the creek, island into every cabin. Men woke with tears on their cheeks, because the collapse bell only ever rang for one reason: when a miner wanted to come home. That evening, the men gathered again in Keller's store, but tonight, something felt different. The walls seemed too thin, the windows too clear. The floorboards too eager to creak. Keller spoke first. "We need to do something." "About who?" Ada asked. "Her," someone whispered. "No," Hollis said, "not her. Him." Bales slammed his fist on the counter. "There is no him. Jonas Marin is dead. I closed that shaft myself." "And yet," Keller said softly, "something is opening it again." A long silence followed. Finally, Hollis spoke. "Tomorrow we go to her. To Eliza. Together. Double quotes. Why?" Bales demanded. "Because," Hollis whispered, "whatever walks beside her is learning to walk ahead of her." That night, the 20th, the valley did not sleep. Men heard picks, women heard whispers. Through cracks in the walls, children dreamed of stone hands brushing their blankets. And Eliza? Eliza stood on her porch, lantern lit, her shawl unmoving in the wind. At her feet, the snow melted in a wide circle, wide enough for two people. Wide enough for a man and the thing that used to be a man. She whispered to the dark. "Not yet. Not yet. Not yet." But the wind carried her words upward, to the ridge where the lantern flickered and where something answered her in a low, grinding voice. "Soon." The morning of December 21st began wrong. Not in a way a man could point to. Not a missing mule, nor a broken fence, nor a sudden illness. The wrongness lay in the air. It felt crowded. If the valley held more breaths than people living there. The sky sagged low, a hard gray wool blanket pressing on the roofs. Snow refused to fall, as though the clouds were holding their breath along with the people. Keller stepped onto his porch before dawn and felt it immediately. The ground was warm, not thawed warm, as though the mountain drew breath upward through the frozen soil. He knelt, pressed his palm flat and jerked it back, warm and trembling, a vibration so faint it felt like a heartbeat beneath stone. Keller whispered to the dirt, "Don't." But the mountain did not belong to his warnings. Across Hollow Creek, other signs surfaced like secrets rising from deep water. At the Finch cabin, Tobias opened the barn door and found every two. "I kept the lantern lit," she said, "every night. 4 winters. A light for him to follow." "Why?" Hollis asked, terrified to hear the answer. Eliza looked away. "Because the dead should not be alone." The discussion ended not by agreement, but by a sound that ripped through the valley like a crack in the sky. Clang. 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 The buried mine bell, old emergency bell from No. 3 shaft, rang from deep Underground. Once. Twice. Three times. The code miners used for one thing. A man alive beneath collapsed. Ada dropped to her knees in the snow, hands pressed to her ears. No, she whispered. No, 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 this is old. This is 4-year-old death. This ain't now. But the bell kept ringing, each blow more frantic than the last. Clang, 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 Sealand. Then silence. Raw, unnatural silence. Eliza closed her eyes. A tear rolled down, freezing on her cheek before it reached her jaw. He's closer, she said. If the valley had possessed any courage left, they would have gone to Eliza Thentry to reclaim her from the thing she had summoned from the depths. But mountain folk fear more than specters. They fear shame. They fear being wrong. So instead they went home, each to their own corner of the valley, and waited for the night. The mountain gave up its breathing. Instead, it listened. Near dusk, Hollis lit every lantern in the chapel and knelt to pray. The flames quivered, though the air was still. Halfway through his prayer, he heard it again. That voice. Low. Grinding. Stone shifting against stone. It seeped through the floorboards, through the cracked foundations, through the hollow places beneath the church. Jonas? Hollis whispered, terrified of his own lips forming the name. The answer came not as a word, but as a scraping sound like a hand dragging across wood from beneath the chapel floor. The boards bowed upward. Hollis stumbled backward so fast he knocked over 2 lanterns. Flames licked the floor, but the boards still. Silence returned, not peacelence like a jaw clenched shut. The Reverend did not finish his prayer. Across the creek, Tobias Finch had troubles of his own. He'd been forbidden to leave the cabin after sunset, but boys carry rebellion in their pockets like pebbles. So he slipped out to the barn to check on the mule. He regretted it the moment he pulled the barn door shut behind him. Because in the far corner of the barn, in a patch of moonlight that slipped through a broken plank, stood a lamp, not a lantern. A miner's lamp, the old kind, rusted, its flame shuddering with each breath of the barn, and next to it, a pair of boots coated in damp clay. Boots that dripped. Boots that were not attached to any legs, just boots, standing upright, facing him. Tobias backed away slowly, his breath hot in the frozen air. The boots took a step forward, a long, wet, sucking step. Tobias ran for the door, but the door closed on its own, latch sliding shut with a decisive click. Inside the barn, the light dimmed, then flared, and the boots stepped closer. Step, step, step. Tobias screamed loud enough to wake the Ridge. His father came running with a lantern and broke the latch with his shoulder. Door slamming open to reveal nothing. Tobias huddled in the hay, trembling and sobbing, pointing at the corner where the boots had stood. Nothing remained. No footprints. No clay. No lamp. Only a faint, acrid smell. Damp stone, the smell of a mine chamber with no air. Farther down the valley, Keller had his own midnight visitor. He'd been adding numbers in his ledger when someone knocked on his door. A slow knock. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. A miner's rhythm. Keller froze. He whispered through the door, "Who's there?" No answer. He pressed his ear to the wood. A voice went raspy, as though distorted by depths, murmured, "Lantern. Need the lantern." Keller stepped back so quickly, he knocked over his chair. "Get away," he whispered. The voice didn't leave. It moved to the window. A shadow passed by, tall, lean, stiff in its movement like a body pulled upward through mud. Something brushed the glass. A finger, not a finger, a stone-dusted knuckle. Keller blew out the lamp. Dark swallowed the room whole, and that shadow remained at the window long after the flame died. At the Pike home, Ada woke to the sound of humming. A low tune, melodic but broken, like a song remembered by someone whose memory was rotted through. The miner's hymn, the hymn the men used to sing walking into. No, 3 shaft. A wave of dread washed her. She rose slowly, wrapped her shawl, and stepped toward her front room. The prince had not filled in overnight. The snow around them had refused to fall. As if whatever left them had commanded even the weather to step aside. Hollis arrived first. He stood in the road, hugging his coat around him, lantern unlit in his trembling hand. When Keller joined him, the storekeeper whispered, "You see them?" Hollis nodded. They didn't leave tracks going away." "No," Hollis said softly. "They only came." Keller swallowed. "Where are they now?" Hollis said nothing, because he already knew. The valley already knew. Some knowledge requires no wordsenly fear. Before anyone dared approach Eliza's porch that morning, Foreman Bales arrived at a near run. His breath fogged the air in short bursts, and his face, always stern, was ashen with something deeper than anger. "Tobias found something," he said. "You'd best come." The group followed him to the schoolhouse, boots crunching through ice. Inside, Tobias Finch huddled in the corner beside the stove, a blanket around his shoulders, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. On the teacher's desk lay a bundle of papers, edges torn, stained with clay. Ada Pike leaned over them. "What's this, child?" Tobias swallowed. "Found him stuffed under the door this morning. Something wedged him in, like a hand that don't bend right." Keller picked up the top sheet carefully. His breath caught. It was a page from the mining records of 1898. Bales froze at the sight. He recognized the handwriting. His own. He reached for the next sheet, a ledger page, warped at the edges, showing the list of men sent into No. 3 on the morning of the collapse. One name had been altered, not crossed out, added back in with fresh ink. Jonas Marin, returned. November 28, 1902. Hollis sucked in a sharp breath. But Bales kept turning page hands unsteady. Now. Next page. A torn scrap of diary paper, written in a jagged, desperate hand. November 30th, 1902. If the mountain gives me back my breath, it is not kindness. I hear her voice through the stone. Eliza calling me. I dig not toward the sky, but toward the sound of her sorrow. J. Maida Pike's eyes glistened. Eliza wrote no letters. She whispered. She never learned her letters proper. Jonas wrote this himself. More pages. Sketch of the mountain shaft. Crude. Drawn in charcoal that crumbled. When touched, Hollis pointed with a shaking finger. Look there. At the bottom of the sketch, a black void, marked only with one word, hollow. Bales stiffened like wood left in frost. That weren't any map chamber, he muttered. Not in no survey. Not in no engineer's notes. Keller asked, "What was it then?" Bales didn't answer, but the terror on his face told enough. The last page chilled them to the bone. It was written not in ink, but in something darker, a brown smear that refused to dry. Not blood. Clay, mixed with something living. Once. The earth took my name. I dug until my fingers were stone. The others followed. We followed the lantern. We follow her tears. We follow. Mem. E.J. Ada covered her mouth. Hollis shut his eyes tight. Keller whispered, "Others? What others?" Tobias shrank into his blanket. "They came in the night," he whispered. "Not inside, but right outside. I heard him, scratching. 40 shoes on the ground." "No," Hollis said, voice trembling, "not shoes." Outside, the wind rose, pushing a thin veil of sleet against the windows. The papers lay scattered like dead leaves. Finally Bales spoke, voice flat and hollow. "These men, Jonas and the others, they didn't crawl out as ghosts." His throat bobbed. "They crawled out as miners, still doing the only thing they knew, digging." "Digging to what?" Keller whispered. "Not what," Bales said darkly. "Who?" Their eyes drifted unwillingly. Eliza's cabin down the road. That was when the screaming began. Sharp. Raw. Echoing through the valley like a cut in the air. Children rushed to the windows. Ada dropped her shawl. Hollis bolted for the door. Keller grabbed his coat. The scream came a second Timia man's voice. Choked in fear from the direction of the old mine road, they ran as a group, Bales leading. The others struggling to keep up, their breath tore through the cold. Their boots slipping on ice at the bend near the creek. They found him, Silas Crow, sprawled on the ground. One leg trapped in a hole that hadn't been there minutes before. The hole was narrow, fresh, not dug by shovel, dug by hands. Silas's eyes were rolled white. "Get it off me," he shrieked. "Get it off. It's still holding." Bales reached him first, hauling him up by the shoulders. The hole beneath Silas collapsed inward as though something let go. A cold exhale wafted from the darkness below, carrying with it smell of Jonas Marin rose from beneath the cabin floor like a man waking from a nightmare, but no nightmare ends so quietly that he emerged in a slow, deliberate heave, shoulders scraping splinters from the boards, clay dripping from his hair and thick ropes. The air grew colder. The lantern flame shrank. Trembling as if remembering something it once feared in infancy, Jonas's figure was unmistakably lean. The way he'd been in life, but what stood before them no held the weight of the mountain in its frame. His face was clay-soft, sunken in places where rock had pressed too long. His fingers were stiff, claws of dried soil still clinging to the nails. His eyes were not eyes, just dark hollows where something flickered low, like the memory of a candle guttering in coal dust. Yet when he looked at Eliza, those hollow sockets softened. A sound escaped him, hoof gravel, half-breath. E-Li-Za. Her name spoken in a voice shaped by stone and darkness. Eliza stepped forward, no fear, as if he were not a revenant but her husband returning home from a shift. "Oh, Jonas," she whispered, touching his cheek. Clay crumbled under her fingers. "You came back." He leaned into her hand, a motion both tender and terrible. Behind them, the others stood petrified. Keller pressed into the corner, shaking violently. Ada whispered prayers so fast the words tangled. Hollis wept openly, his faith and fear locked in battle. Bales held his knife, though every instinct told him to drop it and run. Jonas turned toward the man. The temperature dropped further, his breath it was fogged, the air in a gray plume that smelled of deep earth. Hollis stammered, Jonas Marin. "Do you know us?" Jonas's head tilted, a slow, creaking movement. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he raised his left hand, and beneath the clay he saw a twisted, healed-over scar, the same scar Jonas had carried in life. He remembered, but remembrance was not the same as mercy. Before anyone could move, the ground beneath the cabin shuddered violently. Another hand burst through the boards. Then another beside it, and another, and another. 40-2 hands in all, wide, broken, clay-encrusted, reached through the floor like weeds, erupting from a graveyard. Hollis screamed. Keller dropped to his knees. Ada fainted. Bales dove forward, grabbing Hollis by the collar and dragging him backward. "We need to get out now." But the doors slammed shut, as though commanded by an unseen force. Eliza didn't move. She stepped between Jonas and the rising hands, her face serene. They only came for what they're owed. The boards cracked wide. Shapes clawed their way up, not fast, not hungry, but with the determination of men whose labor had always been downward and now demanded to be upward. They rose from the dark, like pillars of old earth, their bodies caked in decades of forgotten dust. All miners, all lost, all returned. Ada regained consciousness just long enough to choke out, "Eliza, stop them." Eliza shook her head. "I cannot stop men who were promised light and given stone." Jonas took Eliza's hand. His grip was gentle, though his fingers pressed faint bruises in her skin. He turned to her with the desperation of a man who had waited far too long. "We go." Not a threat, a request, a plea. He wanted her to follow him back. beneath the earther out into the night. No one could tell which. Eliza smiled, but there was grief in it, deeper than the mine shaft itself. I cannot go yet, she whispered. I must speak with them first. She pointed toward Keller, Bales, Hollis, and Ada. They must understand. Jonas's head jerked, unnatural, like stone cracking. He did not want to wait, but he released her hand. She stepped past Hyman, addressed the trembling group. You think this is vengeance, she said softly, but this is only sorrow. The miners gathered behind Herselant, still, their hollow eyes fixed on her lantern. She held the lantern up. This flame kept them walking. This flame kept them hoping, not to punish but to be seen. Keller sobbed. Seen? Eliza, they're dead. No, she answered. They were forgotten, which is worse. She looked at Jonas, then at the others. When the collapse happened, they called out for days. No one came for them. The mountain heard them first. Hollis whispered, horrified. It gave them back to you. Eliza nodded. And they followed because I was the only one who still called their names. Her voice trembled now. They are homesick. The miners shifted, swaying slightly, slow, unconscious motion of men waiting in a dark tunnel for orders. Bales stepped forward, knife shaking. Eliza, what do they want from us? Eliza lowered her lantern. The flame dimmed. They want what was promised. Ada's breath caught. And what's that? Eliza answered, rest. Before they could react, the floor split, Woody a yawning wound in the cabin. Clay dust billowed upward, cold, rolled out like a wave. Jonas stepped into the fracture, 1 foot sinking into the darkness below. He held out his hand to Eliza. Eliza. His voice was a cavern collapsing inward. This was her moment. They knew it. She knew it. Ada cried out, don't go with him. Eliza turned. Her face shone with tears, but she smiled. It is my place. She stepped toward him. Before she could take his hand, the valley shuddered with a thunderous groan. The house shook. Lanterns fell. Snow tumbled from the roof, in a sheet. And somewhere deep below, the echo of a long-forgotten support beam. Cracked. Jonas froze.